シントンの朝です。今ですね、ニューヨークの連総会の関係で、米韓の首脳会談その原子の潜水艦も含めた、なんか、軍をしたりところで、今、速報にですね、ちょっと掘り方がちょっと分からなくて、なんか、同じやつを2つぐらい分析してしまったんですけど、見ていただいて、届いて後で見てください。インデックスに国連総会の22日から25日。2つもね、多分同じです。間違えて2回言わせてしまった。はい。いいです。いいです。はい。お願いします。米韓首脳会談ですね。原子力潜水艦購入同じやつ日本来てますか？すみません、その1個すみません。はい、そうです、そうです。
go with him. Take the just going out. They'll pull it down. You're right. They'll pull it down on the quick. I'm gonna leave this all in play though.
All right, everyone, while we wait for this Nikki Haley press conference to begin, I want to go ahead and take you guys to Mexico City, where we have a live feed of the search and rescue efforts and recovery efforts that are underway.
Sí, todos.
All right, everyone, it appears that this is now tape playback coming in from our Fox station in Los Angeles. Fox reporter Gigi Graciette is there live in Mexico City. Looks like they're feeding back some of the video that they shot from earlier today in Mexico City as search and rescue crews work to dig through the debris following Tuesday's magnitude 7.1 earthquake. All right, everyone, let's go back now to New York City. We are awaiting Nikki Haley, who should be speaking any moment now.
Good afternoon. Well, we have had a very productive and strong week at the UN. You saw the United States had a very strong presence with the President, the Vice President, many members of the National Security Team, as well as his economic team. The United States was out in full force, and I think the UN felt it, but I think it was extremely productive. You look at the beginning of the week, and we started with UN reform. You had the President and the Secretary General rolling out massive reforms for the UN. What was extraordinary was we had 130 countries that have now signed on to that reform. That's over 2/3 of the General Assembly, which is who is going to vote on this at the end. So that was a great start to the week. Then you saw the President's address to the General Assembly, and I think it showed the strength of the United States, but it also asked the world to come together, and it asked all the countries to come together as we fight these rogue regimes, and mainly North Korea and Iran. And I think what you saw were a lot of countries responded. They were very positive to the speech. They appreciated how blunt and honest he was. I think that's been the overall theme from the international community this week, is how straightforward he was and how refreshing it was as they heard him speak. We also today met with our allies, Japan and South Korea. Obviously a lot to talk about with North Korea, and so we had good conversations with them, and the president reassured, obviously, Japan and South Korea, but they also talked about strategies going forward for North Korea. On Iran, that was a topic of conversation throughout the week. I think everyone was talking about the destabilizing activities that they continue to do throughout the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and the list goes on. So it is something that we will continue to talk about and continue to move forward to make sure that we're stopping any of their reckless behavior as well. We also co-hosted a meeting with Secretary Boris Johnson as well as the Dutch Foreign Minister Bert Koenders on human rights reform, and really talked about the fact that it needed to be representative of its name. We have a lot of bad actors on that council. Both the president and the vice president spoke about it in their speeches, and the need to see better quality countries that are on that council in order for it to be effective, and obviously for the United States to stay on it. If we don't see changes in the Human Rights Council, we'll continue to advocate for human rights, but we'll do it on our own if we have to. And then the vice president attended a Security Council meeting yesterday on peacekeeping reform. We have made great progress this past several months in terms of reforming peacekeeping so that it's actually going towards a political solution. It's transparent, it's accountable, but we're also giving the troops the equipment they need and the ability to be trained in order to do their jobs. And so we're just seeing smarter peacekeeping, and I think that all came together in the peacekeeping reform vote that we had yesterday. One of the topics that everyone had to talk about this week and all had an opinion on was Burma. And as we're dealing with the crisis in Burma and we're seeing how much migration has taken place from the Rohingyas going out of Burma, every country is concerned. They're concerned that the military continues to be aggressive, and they're concerned that the government continues to be in denial. And so I think you'll continue to see the international community talk about that. I think you will only see them get more active on that as we go forward. And finally, today the Security Council took a great step forward. It was a measure that I think the international community had been working on a long time. We certainly worked with our British friends on it, and that was ISIS accountability in Iraq. If you look at the fact that there have been massive mass graves, there have been all types of terrible conducts to women and girls in those areas, whether it's what's happened with the Yazidis or the Christians or the Sunni and Shia Muslims. What we now have is a part of the UN body that's going to be able to go in there and actually collect evidence and make sure that it can be used in trials so that the victims finally have their say and get their day in court. So, or at least their families do if they've lost loved ones. So that was a big day for the Security Council today. And with that, there was obviously a lot more. I think the president met with multiple countries. There were lots of bilats. There was a lot of talk and planning and productivity. But overall, we can say it was a solid week at the UN this week, and it was highly successful. But with that, I'll answer any of your questions. Yes.
Ambassador Haley. Thank you very much. Why do you expect this latest round of sanctions will work when an array of sanctions have failed in the past against North Korea?
Is this in reference to what Secretary Mnuchin talked about? This is pretty amazing because when you look at the sanctions that we have in place, North Korea is already feeling it. You can already hear of the lines at the gas stations that they have, and the fact that they are having a severe reduction in revenues is the sanctions are working. What this does is take it a step further. This says anyone that deals with North Korea, any financial institution that deals with North Korea is going to be punished. And so I think it's important. And it's like Secretary Mnuchin said, if you're going to support North Korea, then you have to be prepared to be sanctioned as well.
And did you say that sanctions have been working, and yet North Korea hasn't stopped nuclear provocations? Do you think that these sanctions are going to actually get North Korea to listen?
We always knew that the sanctions may not work. What the goal of the sanctions was always intended to be is to cut the revenue so they could do less of their reckless behavior. If they don't have the funding for the ballistic missiles, for the nuclear production, then they can do less of it. That's the goal of the sanctions. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to change Kim's attitude or his belief on what he wants to do, but it will slow down the production of the nuclear process going forward. Yes.
Ambassador, thank you. When the president spoke in his speech about totally destroying North Korea if forced to defend ourselves or our allies, what exactly did he mean? Under what circumstances would he consider totally destroying North Korea?
Well, I think that's just common sense. I mean, if you look at it, we have said multiple times, the president said it, members of his team have said it, we don't want war. That's the last thing anyone wants. We don't want loss of life. That's the last thing anyone wants. But at the same time, we're not going to run scared. If, for any reason, North Korea attacks the United States or our allies, the U.S. will respond, period. That's what's going to happen. What you're seeing now is we continue to go through diplomatic measures. We continue to exhaust everything we have. And the key right now is that other countries actually support the sanctions and follow through with them. And they also continue to isolate North Korea until we can get them to come to the negotiating table. But until then, that's just the reality. If they were to strike the United States, of course we would have to respond back. Yes.
Just to clarify, so you're specifically saying that is if North Korea attacks first?
I mean, we can't play out the scenarios on what's going to happen, but obviously it would take something very serious for the president to have to make a decision to do something back. But there's a lot of things between where we are now and that situation that can be done. There are a lot of military options that can be done. And so the president's not going to spell out specifically what he's going to do, when he's going to do it, or where he's going to do it. But there are many options that he's discussed with his national security team that should North Korea do anything irresponsible or reckless, that he has to choose from.
Ambassador, thank you. Just a quick one on the sanctions on Korea, and then I have a question on Iran. On Korea, the administration has said that this is not aimed at China, but you heard the president say today that China has, told its central bank not to do business with North Korea. Secretary Mnuchin said that he called the Chinese. So how is this not, and especially you've talked about how China is really the main financial backer of North Korea, so how can this not really be directed at China? And then on Iran, is there a way to ramp up pressure, as what you were talking about, Iran's destabilizing activities throughout the Middle East, which I think a lot of your allies agree on, without violating the agreement per se, as Secretary Tillerson said? I mean, is there a way to get allies to rally around more terrorism type and other sanctions while keeping the nuclear provisions in place?
So first of all, with the sanctions on North Korea, it only impacts those that continue to do business with North Korea. So if China does business with North Korea, yes, it will impact them. If there are countries in Africa that do business with North Korea, it's going to impact them. So really it depends on countries that choose to continue to support North Korea over the rest of the world that's asking them not to. In reference to Iran, you have a couple of processes that take place. On October 15th, the president has the decision to make on whether to certify or decertify. And that's U.S. law. That has nothing to do with the JCPOA or the Iran deal. That's U.S. law. And U.S. law requires the president every 90 days to decide whether the Iran deal and other elements of the UN resolution, which would include ballistic missile testing, which would include arms smuggling, which would include support of terrorism, those things, it asks the president to look at all of those things. And if he still thinks that the deal is in the best interests of the United States, then he certifies. If he thinks that the deal is, that the situation is not in the best interests of the American public, then he doesn't certify. At that point, it goes to Congress. And he works with Congress on how to reshape the situation. But the Iran deal and U.S. law are two different things.
You're saying that he could decertify without specifically withdrawing from the deal.
That's right. I mean, that's just the option that he has, and that's the Corker-Cardin law that came into effect that allowed that to happen. What I will tell you from a UN perspective, what we're looking at and what you're going to hear us very vocal on is the fact that 2331, the resolution that was in place, what we saw was it basically wrapped in with the nuclear deal. It said if Iran did any of these things, it would be in violation. And since then, the Secretary General has come out with a report that said they have violated all of those things. Their support for terrorism, their arms smuggling, the idea that they continue to do ballistic missile testing, and they need to be called out for that. And that's something that you will see us do as we go forward in the United Nations, to make sure that they know that just because we did this nuclear deal, it doesn't give them a pass on all the other things that they're doing wrong. Yes.
Ambassador, you said that just in your opening remarks that one of the topics that everybody had an opinion about this week and was talking about was Burma. The president gave a 4,600-word address to the global UN body, in which he didn't mention the word Burma or Myanmar at all. Did you have any direct input in the speech? Did you press him to address Burma in the speech, or were you disappointed that he did not?
Well, I can tell you he's very concerned about Burma because he's talked to the national security team and asked exactly what was going to be done. He asked the vice president to speak about it in his speech, which is why the vice president has, and he's been very involved in the decision making. I think that he, like every other leader, can tell you we're all scratching our heads over Burma because all this has happened in 3 weeks. You have almost 500,000 people who have left, and the tragedies and the abuse that's happened there is something that a lot of us can't stomach. So no, it's mainly, if you listen to all the leaders, everybody is just trying to figure out who can move the officials in Burma and where to go. So
he don't think he's spoken publicly about it.
Well, he's very concerned about Burma, and I think that I did talk with the vice president about it quite a bit, and that's why he was very passionate about, but really he was speaking because the president asked him to.
The President Trump, since he's taken office, spoken directly with Aung San Suu Kyi, and he's done so in the last few days, or anybody in the administration talk to her about what's happening? And would you press her publicly to do more in her role as State Counsel?
Not only have we pressed her, we've pressed the military. So we had two things happening. Secretary Tillerson did call her and did discuss the situation with her, but then also General Dunford is calling the head of the military to say, look, we've had a relationship with you, but this cannot continue, and we need to know what you're going to do about it. Yes.
Yes, Madam Ambassador, you've been very vocal on the shortcomings of the Iran deal and Iran's behavior, perhaps beyond the strict confines of your job here. Where does that come from? Is this your own sort of direct opinion after hearing about Iranian behavior here? Or through conversations with the president, or just talk a little bit about that?
I had conversations with the president. He was very concerned about Iran. He was very concerned about the deal. And so I went to learn about it and to find out from the IAEA, to look at the resolution, to look at the violations. And so it was just digging deep on the situation of what we found, and then that's why I gave the speech on the scenario that the president's being faced with on the decisions to be made. But this situation, it's not an easy situation by any means, because you look at North Korea and you look at the fact that for 25 years we were looking at bad deal after bad deal after bad deal and broken promise, broken promise, broken promise. So here we are again, and we don't want to be dealing with the next North Korea. And so that's why he's taking it so seriously and saying we need to look at every aspect of this and make sure that it truly is in the best interest of the American public. Yes.
The German foreign minister said today that any disavowal of the Iran deal would reduce the likelihood of getting any similar disarmament deal with North Korea. Do you share those concerns that any actions on the Iran deal might reduce the possibility of getting a deal with North Korea? And separately, as a point of clarification, do you support a full oil embargo on North Korea?
So I think let's go back to Iran in the first place. What I will tell you is a lot of countries are going to have their opinions on whether the U.S. should stay in the deal or not. But those countries don't have Iranians saying death to America. They're not saying death to Germany. They're not saying all of those things. What we can see is terrorist attacks happening everywhere with ties to Iran. And that's something we need to be careful about. And so it has never moved the U.S. to care about what other countries say. What does move the president is, are we doing everything in the best security interests for the American people, and that's what you're seeing is playing out. In terms of comparing Iran to North Korea, that's exactly what we're doing. Is we had so many bad deals with North Korea, and everybody looked the other way. And every time they broke that deal, they looked the other way. Well, where are we now? They now have a hydrogen bomb. They now have ICBM. So if we don't do something, and we make the same mistakes we made with North Korea, we will be dealing with Iran that has nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology. And so that's the concern, and that's what we're trying to do with that. Yes.
Madam Ambassador, the President said this week that he's made his decision on Iran. Can you tell us what it is?
No.
I wanted to try. On a separate issue, the President also addressed Venezuela in his remarks this week at the UN. And he also had a meeting with Latin American leaders. Can you tell us a little bit more about what he said to them? And I understand in particular that they suggested to the President that an oil embargo on Venezuela would be the most effective way of addressing that problem. Is that something that the United States would consider?
Well, I think that I was in the dinner with the Latin American, with our Latin American friends, and I could tell you there was a lot of concern from all of them on what's happening in Venezuela. They have all tried. We saw they tried through the OAS, and Venezuela got out of that. We've tried to do it through multiple avenues to get to Maduro and let him know what's not acceptable. The U.S. has moved forward on sanctions, and they were not opposed to that. So, yes, there were some conversations on what they recommended going forward, but I don't think I should share that. I can tell you that there's a lot of support in Latin America to see Venezuela start to respect its people and go back to the democracy it's supposed to be. And I think every one of them was concerned about what's happening right now.
Can you share just your own thoughts about an oil embargo in Venezuela, though? Is that something that...
Well, look, if things don't improve, all those options are always there. And so that's what we're watching to see. First it was sanctions, and now we'll look and see. It's not off the table, I can tell you that.
Ambassador, thank you. There's been a lot of speculation about your political future and your future within the Trump administration. Some people are even saying that you're gunning to be Secretary of State and trying to push Rex Tillerson out. Could you please address these comments and speculation?
There's going to be chatter about things ever since I was a legislator. People have talked about what I'm trying to do or what I'm supposed to do. What I'm trying to do is do a good job, and I'm trying to be responsible in my job, and I'm trying to make sure that I inform the American people everything that I know. That's what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to serve the President of this country the best I can. If people want to take it to mean something else, that's their issue. It's not anything I spend time on.
Do you want to be Secretary of State?
No, I do not.
Ambassador, how can the U.S. maintain its diplomatic credibility and get a nuclear deal with North Korea when it is willing to consider blowing up, damaging, putting in peril the existing diplomatic deal with Iran on its program? Doesn't this undermine U.S. credibility?
It does not undermine U.S. credibility. What it shows is that the United States is going to always watch out for its people, and that just because there was some agreement that was agreed to, the smartest thing any country can do is go back and look at it and say, is it working? Not have too much pride to say, oh, I signed it, I have to continue to be a cheerleader. Is it working? And I'll ask you, do you think that deal is working when Iran continues to test ballistic missiles? Do you think that deal is working when they are supporting terrorists everywhere, from Lebanon to Yemen to Syria to Iraq? Do you think it's still working? And do you think it's still working when they're smuggling arms and now working with North Korea? Is that in the best interests of the United States? I would question that, because what you're looking at is a country that says death to America, working with other countries that may also want the same thing, and the President has the responsibility to make sure nothing happens to Americans. And I think that's what he's trying to do. Back in the back.
Thank you, Ambassador Haley. I'm from Bangladesh. I want to know, I have two questions on Myanmar, Burma. Bangladesh Prime Minister had a conversation with the President Trump, and after that conversation she said in an international news agency that President Trump is not willing to resolve this issue. But we can understand the United States is doing a lot to resolve this issue. So will you make any comment about this Prime Minister remarks to the international news agency? Second thing, will you give any time limit to the Myanmar Burman Authority to return back the refugee, as Bangladesh is facing huge crisis to accommodate these numbers of the refugee in the Bangladesh territory?
I think the United States has been taken aback that so much has happened and gone in such a terrible direction in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And I think what you're seeing is every member of the national security team is talking about it. And every member of the national security team right now is calling their contacts and their counterparts in Burma, as well as making sure that we're supporting Bangladesh in what they're doing. Bangladesh has been unbelievable in taking on these refugees. But at the same time, we have to look at the refugees as now they have no home. And it's no way for any one person to live. The human rights situation is terrible. And we want to make sure that we're doing all we can. So what I can tell you is it's all hands on deck in terms of the National Security Council trying to look at it and say, what steps are we going to take next? Okay, last question.
After losing ground in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State is looking at Libya as a new possible base. Are you in favor of sending back the UN system to Libya, the UNHCR, to manage the refugee camps? And what is the United States ready to do to prevent terroristic infiltration in Libya?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you that if you look at the situation, I think that we have made amazing progress in Iraq and Syria in terms of defeating ISIS. And that's almost been complete, and we're very proud of that. In terms of Libya, that's been something that the National Security Council is meeting with and deciding what our next plans are going to be, and I'm sure they'll roll that out when they're ready. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, that was the end of that press conference with U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. A large portion of that press conference focused on the sanctions against North Korea. However, other journalists in the room did ask questions on a number of topics affecting the world, including the situation in Myanmar, Burma, regarding the refugees. Nikki Haley addressing that issue at the end as well. I want to go ahead and continue our News Now coverage. We want to show you Jeff Sessions from earlier today.
And for all you legislators who are here, and I know we were convincing in the lobby about how tough it is to always do the right thing and to stand up for your beliefs, we applaud all of you for doing that as well. So as the Attorney General of the state of Alabama, a longtime conservative voice.
All right, everyone, we're actually going to cut out of this. We'll show you this a little bit later on. We want to instead take you live to the UN because Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is speaking.
Any new direction. If would-be proliferators seek security or to improve their standing in the world or to enhance the prosperity of their citizens and their people's hope for a brighter future, proliferation will not provide these things. There are much better proven ways for nations to establish and enhance their standing, such as deepening their trade integration with the rest of the world, adhering to international standards and agreements, and participating in humanitarian activities. The Korean Peninsula serves as a stark example of these differing paths. While North Korea has shunned the international community and let its people starve while it relentlessly pursues nuclear weapons, South Korea has opted not to pursue nuclear weapons and is fully engaged with the international community. As a result, South Korea has grown into one of the world's great economic powers with a GDP over 100 times that of its neighbor to the north. By contrast, though, North Korea may assume that nuclear weapons will ensure the survival of its regime. In truth, nuclear weapons are clearly only leading to greater isolation, ignominy, and deprivation. Continued threats against us, the U.S., and now the entire global community will not create safety for the regime, but will rather stiffen our collective resolve and our commitment to deterring North Korean aggression. North Korea is a case study in why nations must work to preserve and strengthen global non-proliferation norms. As we look to the future, the international community's record of enforcing compliance with non-proliferation obligations and commitments is not what we need it to be. It is partly for lack of such accountability that we find ourselves in the situation we are in with North Korea at the moment. Though it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the mid-1980s, North Korea never came into full compliance with the treaty and cheated on every subsequent arrangement designed to remedy that noncompliance and rein in the nuclear threat it now presents. There are also lessons here for Iran, which was on its own pathway to develop nuclear weapons in violations of its non-proliferation treaty and nuclear safeguards obligations, and multiple legally binding UN Security Council resolutions. Iran seems keen to preserve for itself the option to resume such work in the future, even while sponsoring international terrorism, developing missile systems capabilities of delivering nuclear weapons, and destabilizing its neighbors in a dangerous quest of regional hegemony. The collective responsibilities of meeting such proliferation challenges will require more from all of us. As President Trump said in his speech on Tuesday, if we are to embrace the opportunities of the future and overcome the present dangers together, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. As strong, sovereign, and independent nations, we must work together bilaterally, regionally, and globally to stem the tide of proliferation. Sovereign states acting in unison will produce a global good. We especially urge Russia to examine how it can better support global nonproliferation efforts. As the world's two most powerful nuclear states, Russia and the United States share the greatest responsibility for upholding nonproliferation norms and stopping the further spread of nuclear weapons. We have cooperated well before. The United States and the Soviet Union worked together closely in drafting most of the text that became the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which helped keep proliferation under control through the Cold War. Washington and Moscow did this, moreover, notwithstanding their own Cold War rivalry and the many problems in their bilateral relationship. In the post-Cold War era, Russia worked hard to improve accountability for its nuclear stockpile dispersed across the former Soviet Union, and we engaged closely in cooperative efforts through the Nunn-Lugar program to reduce the risk of weapons or material falling into the hands of proliferators or terrorists. Unfortunately, in recent years, Russia has often acted in ways that weaken global norms and undercut efforts to hold nations accountable. Examples include violating its own obligations under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, flouting the security assurances it made at the end of the Cold War, impeding efforts to build on the legacy of past international efforts on nuclear security, and seeking to weaken the International Atomic Energy Agency's independence in investigating clandestine nuclear programs. If Russia wants to restore its role as a credible actor in resolving the situation with North Korea, it can prove its good intentions by upholding its commitments to establish international efforts on nuclear security and arms control. Cooperation from China is also essential if the international community is to bring North Korean nuclear and missile threats under control and prevent a catastrophe spiraling of instability and conflict on the Korean Peninsula. If China truly desires to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula to promote stability and to avoid conflict in that sensitive region right on its own border, now's the time to work with the rest of us, the rest of the international community, to put the kind of pressure on North Korea that can change its strategic calculation before it's too late. And lastly, we must be fully aware that there are non-state actors who will never conform to international norms governing nuclear weapons. Their grand-scale terror attacks, beheadings, crucifixions, burnings, rapes, torture, acts of enslavement expose ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups as those who seek to find glory through death and destruction. Their eagerness to commit atrocity makes clear that if given the chance, they would commit death and destruction on an even larger scale. And there is no scale larger than a nuclear attack on one of the world's cities. Many jihadist groups aspire to detonate a nuclear device in the heart of a booming metropolis. Their mission is to kill our people and send the world into a downward spiral. We must never allow this. We must continue to work to secure nuclear technologies, blueprints, and materials at their sources and disrupt proliferation networks. We must deepen information sharing between intelligence agencies in order to identify actors and identify when nuclear materials have been or may be diverted from legitimate uses. And we must revive the practice of creating alternative career and job opportunities for nuclear experts so they do not sell their skills on the black market. But ultimately, the best means to halt jihadists in their quest for nuclear weapons is to destroy them long before they can reach their goal. Whether on the battlefield, in the streets, or online, terrorism must be given no quarter. We must remain ever vigilant against the spread of ISIS and other Islamist groups in new locations, whether in Africa, Asia, Europe, or elsewhere. One of the great successes of the campaign of the coalition to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria has been uprooting ISIS from formerly safe havens in which they could freely mastermind attacks against targets the world over. These efforts must continue. As a body committed to security, we must treat nuclear proliferation with the seriousness it deserves. For those of us on the Security Council, counteracting nuclear threats begins with full enforcement of the UN Security Council resolutions all member states are bound to implement. To make sure all nations are able to play their part, we must continue to work for full and effective implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1540. But signing treaties and passing resolutions is not enough. Stopping nuclear proliferation also entails exercising other levers of power, whether diplomatic, economic, digital, moral, or if necessary, military. Ultimately, we each have a sovereign responsibility to ensure that we keep the world safe from nuclear warfare, the aftermath of which will transgress all borders. The United States will continue to work to halt the proliferation of nuclear weapons. We ask all peace-loving nations to join us in this mission. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Secretary Tillerson for his statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kairat Abdurrahmanov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Minister. I thank the Ethiopian presidency for providing this platform, and also High Representative Nakamitsu, as well as previous distinguished Speaker Secretary Tillerson for their very valuable reflections, including on contribution of my nation to the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. The effective implementation of resolutions, treaties, and conventions, together with sanction regimes, are mutually complementary instruments that prohibit the use and proliferation of WMD. The effectiveness of sanction resolutions is measured by their ability to achieve the mandated goals. We regret to note that the impact of sanctions resolutions does not always meet our expectations. This is often because of the deliberate non-compliance by other states, which undermine our collective efforts to maintain peace and stability. Kazakhstan's approach on this issue has been conceived by President Nursultan Nazarbayev, who has repeatedly underscored the need to develop concrete mechanisms to discourage nuclear weapon-possessing states, not parties to the NPT, from withdrawing from the treaty. In particular, it was proposed by my president that a state's request for withdrawal should be subject to intensive inspection by the IAEA for possible violations, a review of the reasons for withdrawal by NPT member states at an extraordinary conference, an immediate transfer of the matter in case all attempts fail to the Security Council under the Chapter 7, Article 41 of the UN Charter. We therefore recommend that a similar process be applied to states that regularly violate WMD-related resolutions. Certain fundamental questions need to be considered. The rationale for their action. Now UN member states can be motivated not to cooperate with the states under sanctions. Foresee in advance which imposed sanctions are detrimental to the trade and economic interests of other states, and if it would be worthwhile to consider developing compensatory and incentive mechanism to ensure that member states fully adhere to their obligations, or restrict or terminate cooperation with states under sanctions. Today, with regard to DPRK, the dilemma and difficult situation arises when Council is aware that a military solution is not the option, but at the same time, it's not easy to launch a negotiating process. Kazakhstan strongly condemns Pyongyang's defiant, provocative actions. We consider that continued sanctions pressure as a step in the right direction till North Korea heeds the appeal of the world's majority. We thus suggest that involved parties should reduce tensions and weigh the prospects of all possible decisions. We view the joint proposals of Russia and China as worthy to consideration. The role of Secretary General Guterres as a mediator cannot be underestimated. Therefore, developing and adopting a universal document within the UN on negative guarantees and non-aggression by P5 and other nuclear powers is most relevant and would be a significant incentive for the DPRK to return to the NPT as a non-nuclear state. Implementation of the robust steps undertaken by President Nursultan Nazarbayev, namely closing the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site and denunciation of the fourth world's largest nuclear arsenal, required very much cooperative and efforts on behalf of Russian Federation and the United States. And their cooperation in assisting to my nation to get rid of its nuclear legacy, as well as in rehabilitation of the former Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, was exemplary. And I believe that the United States and Russian Federation could continue this very much fruitful and mutually beneficial cooperation in new circumstances with regard to some new threats emerging in contemporary world. In order to assure effective implementation of the Security Council, Kazakhstan is ready to offer practical assistance by hosting a regional seminar for Central Asian countries. This would be in conjunction with the 1718 committee. We also highly appreciate the open briefing to be held on 9th of October by the chair of the 1718 committee for all UN member states. On Iran, we would like to note that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program was achieved as a result of intense, prolonged negotiations, and we were honored to host 2 rounds of that talks in our southern capital of Astana. It is necessary of Almaty, sorry. It is necessary to acknowledge that this agreement has put Iran on a nuclear-free path, with the IAEA confirming that Iran is fulfilling all its obligations with regard to the nuclear aspects. We should therefore convincingly show also to Pyongyang the right roadmap with a legal solution that can actually also work pragmatically. It is worth pointing out that it was due to the active efforts of the parties through the determined peace talks that JCPOA was achieved against the backdrop of continuing sanctions. Another glaring illustration of a weakened non-proliferation regime is the case of use of WMD in Syria. In general, Kazakhstan is firmly convinced that the Security Council must be united in its approach at this critical stage in finding a political solution to the crisis in Syria. For our part, we will continue to provide the Astana platform as a complementary in order to facilitate the main negotiation processes in Geneva. In turn, an early resolution of the military and political crisis in Syria will allow us to remove the vacuum that helps chemical weapons to be used with impunity. The non-proliferation regime is greatly supported by the cooperation mechanisms of Resolution 1540, and every effort must be made to strengthen its implementation. My country participates actively in its work and continues to provide financial assistance. In this context, we acknowledge that the nuclear security summits initiated by the United States and followed by others has significantly reduced the nuclear threat and strengthened the global architecture of nuclear safety. My President, Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, has proposed during the launching of the IAEA low-enriched uranium bank facility in Kazakhstan, reviving the process of nuclear security summits and offered Astana as a host for such a summit in the future. He has also proposed to unite the efforts of all the states from nuclear weapon-free zones, which have proved to be one of the most effective means in the fight against the spread of nuclear weapons. Mr. President, all of us need to show responsibility, political will, and wisdom to take decisions of great historical significance. We need to put the good of humanity above national interests, to solve one of the most difficult global problems, to keep the world safe from WMDs. I am confident that we will do so. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Minister Abdurrahmanov for his statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sami Shukriya, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Egypt.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere joy to see you presiding over the Security Council during this month. I would also like to thank Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs for her valuable briefing. We can conclude from that briefing the need for a new and comprehensive approach that would guarantee the adoption of effective measures in an attempt to put an end to the weapons of mass destruction threat. We must also stress the centrality of disarmament and non-proliferation efforts in maintaining international peace and security. In light of the vital importance that Egypt attaches to the disarmament of weapons of mass destruction and their non-proliferation, and seizing this important opportunity to discuss such a crucial issue on such a high level, I have decided against the practice to deliver my statement today in English to guarantee the clarity of my message.
Mr. President, Egypt has always been at the forefront of multilateral efforts aiming at disarmament and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which continue to represent one of the most pressing threats to humanity and to international peace and security. We highly value the indispensable role of the Security Council in addressing proliferation challenges and enforcing the relevant Security Council resolutions and legal framework governing the issue. However, we believe that the methods of work of the Council in this area require significant improvement. We should examine more efficient and inclusive methods that would improve the sense of ownership of the measures adopted, seek stronger utilization of the Secretary General's good offices, and always adopt decisions that reinforce that the final aim of any measures adopted by the Council is to achieve a peaceful political solution. From a more comprehensive perspective, Egypt reiterates its concern over the grave threat posed by the continued existence of nuclear weapons, and we affirm that the total, verifiable, and irreversible elimination of such weapons represents the ultimate guarantee against their proliferation and the ultimate warranty against their use by states or non-state actors. Attaining this goal largely depends on the implementation by the nuclear weapon states of their obligations under Article 6 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and leading the efforts towards the achievement of universal adherence to this treaty, which continues to represent the cornerstone of international security and the core of today's disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. Mr. President, in spite of the evident and tangible progress achieved in the area of non-proliferation, progress towards nuclear disarmament continues to be held hostage to construed conceptions pertaining to strategic stability. It is time for us, members of the United Nations, to have an honest and inclusive discussion on the validity and consistency of those arguments which imply that the possession of nuclear weapons and the reliance on nuclear deterrence contribute to international security and stability. In fact, a closer look at the contemporary non-proliferation challenges, including country-specific cases, would clearly reveal that these challenges, one way or another, stem from the continued existence of nuclear weapons and the discriminatory nature of the non-proliferation regime, which undermines its credibility and effectiveness. There is no doubt that in a world free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, the United Nations and the Security Council would have been much better positioned to address non-proliferation threats and cases of non-compliance in a more credible and non-discriminatory manner. Practice has shown that it is quite elusive to address non-proliferation while disregarding disarmament, or to selectively tackle cases of non-compliance while deliberately ignoring achieving the universality of the NPT. Several recent remarkable developments, such as the adoption of the humanitarian pledge, as well as landmark treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, are clear signs that the circumstances have changed on the international stage. These are clear messages that those non-nuclear weapon states who have truly committed themselves to the principles of disarmament and non-proliferation are becoming increasingly impatient regarding the necessity of seriously addressing the gaps in the prevailing regime and the discrimination embedded therein, which was not intended to last forever at the time that the NPT was negotiated and entered into force. Mr. President, despite the extremely volatile nature of its region, Egypt has proven its good intentions by becoming a party to the NPT and fully implementing its obligations in recognition of the vital role of the NPT in international security. We took these decisions in good faith because we value human life and international security. Furthermore, Egypt has always actively supported and implemented all Security Council resolutions aiming at addressing country-specific proliferation concerns without discrimination, as well as combating the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction by non-state actors. Egypt continues to fully support the Council's role in seeking a peaceful solution to address the DPRK's nuclear activities, which violate the Security Council's resolutions and which we strongly condemn. We also support the Council's supervision of Iran's compliance with its obligations, as well as establishing credible facts regarding the parties responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Nevertheless, the Middle East regrettably continues to be one of the most evident examples of the threats that the non-proliferation regime is facing, and the selective manner in which the Security Council has approached such threats. It is important to recall that the Security Council has failed to implement the stipulations of its Resolution 687, which dates back to 1991, containing an explicit recognition of the objective of establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Therefore, unsurprisingly, the region witnessed an unprecedented level of frustration, especially among the Arab countries, due to the repeated failure in implementing the agreed undertaking to establish a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, as reflected in the resolution on the Middle East of the 1995 NPT Review Conference, which represents an integral part of the decision on the indefinite extension of the treaty. We remain greatly disappointed by the decision of the three states parties to the NPT to block consensus on the final document of the 2015 NPT Review Conference, thus further eroding the credibility of the treaty. Finally, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate our principled position that such thematic cross-cutting issues pertaining to the enforcement of disarmament and non-proliferation commitments should also be addressed in a more inclusive manner with the active involvement of all member states in all relevant organs of the UN. Collective security for all is now more than ever a necessary requirement to achieve the kind of sustainable peace and development that we owe to future generations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Minister Shukri for his statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Pavlo Kilimikin, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening today's meeting on this highly important issue at the request of the delegations of the United States. I also appreciate the substantive briefing by the Under-Secretary General Izumi Nakamitsu. For years, the international community has been working persistently to establish a rule-based international order to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war. We all know this phrase too well. A whole range of international instruments were elaborated to this end, especially in the area of non-proliferation. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has become a key, fundamental element of the system of collective security. Was it a major achievement? Definitely yes. By today, 191 states have adhered to the treaty. Is it an ultimate success? Here I am not certain. Almost 50 years ago, after its entry into force, a possible use of nuclear weapons still remains a threat. Furthermore, some states are still aspiring to create their own nuclear weapon capabilities. In addition to this, the Chemical Weapons Convention, for the first time in many years, is blatantly trampled in Syria. I cannot but mention the growing risk of the most dangerous materials falling into the hands of non-state actors, either intentionally or as a result of neglect or oversight. Mr. President, the mere fact that today we have to discuss again how to enforce Security Council resolutions aimed at preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction clearly proves that the existing system of established norms and principles is eroded. It refers not only to proliferations. It's an indication of a broader problem, namely insufficient implementation of international law and its systematic violations. The current state of affairs can suit only those who seek to undermine the very foundations of the international order. A lack of real accountability for defiance of international norms only encourages further breaches. The North Korea is probably the most important case. Despite numerous decisions by this body, the regime continues its nuclear and missile program, keeping the entire region and its own people hostage. It looks like the North Korean leaders are prepared to sacrifice its own people, starving them to death, just to satisfy their rampant ambitions. Unfortunately, we know how it feels from our own history when the Soviet rulers created handmade famine in Ukraine, selling grain for gold, used slave labor in camps to build up military capacity, and tested nuclear weapons on its own troops just to see how they work. Nuclear ambitions of the North Korean and its recent actions in defiance of Security Council decisions is an open challenge to the entire international community. In the Middle East, the use of chemical weapons, something that was considered unthinkable less than a decade ago, now represents a very clear danger. The task is therefore to reverse this precarious trend and prevent the world from sliding into the state not just lack of rules, but also lawlessness. We must stand united to achieve a universal adherence to rules that we ourselves created. How do we ensure implementation of the Council resolutions to prevent spread of the most dangerous and destructive weapons? Indeed, unconditional and faithful implementation of relevant resolutions is a key prerequisite to reduce the level of threat and to prevent any kind of new provocation. Yet, the Council is not always united and staunch in taking necessary measures for effective, rather than formal response. Breaches of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, as well as the use of the other WMD, such as chemical weapons, should be treated by the international community as a clear danger, which is why I urge Council members to put aside differences and use every tool available to ensure full compliance with relevant decisions. In the absence of political will to do so, the situation can spiral out of control. There should be an unavoidable accountability for each and every violation. The risk in this area arises not only from gaps in national legislation, but also from the rapid development of science and technology, as well as e-commerce, along with the lack of awareness among academics, industry, and civil society. Thus, strengthening cooperation in preventing proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction is a fundamental and absolutely essential. Mr. President, no part of the globe is immune to the risk of proliferation. In the 1990s, Ukraine voluntarily dismantled the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. I remember this time quite well. My father was flying Soviet nuclear bomber, and I started my diplomatic career on nuclear disarmament. And we Ukrainians, we did so being convinced in supremacy of such fundamental international principles as inviolability of international borders and territorial integrity and sovereignty. We believed these principles were sacred to everyone. 2 decades later, we still hold dear those principles, yet we came to realize, unfortunately too well, that they are not sacred to everyone. So I want to stress in this regard that violations of international law, including in the non-proliferation sphere, constitute the single most significant threat to the international peace and security. As you all know, Ukraine is confronting aggression by the nuclear weapon state, by Russia. Brutal violation of the international obligations, including under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, by Russia, who signed to the assurance of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, undermines the whole UN-based security system based on principles and international law. One can also recall in this regard the obligation of nuclear states contained in 2010 NPT Review Conference final document. And I quote, to fully respect their existing commitments with regard to security assistance, end of quote. So more than 3 years ago, Russia performed not just the act of military aggression against Ukraine. By violating the Budapest Memorandum, it also demonstrated that a solemn promise of nuclear power to respect independence and sovereignty of Ukraine, to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the UN Charter, is now worth nothing. So the Russian narrative that it did not breach the Budapest Memorandum since nuclear weapons were not used against my country, it is another cynical manipulation. So just think of the impression it made in the eyes of states seeking to bolster their deterrent potential. Just think of the impact to the global non-proliferation infrastructure. And actually, recent drills on launching a massive nuclear missile strike, which was conducted during the West 2017 exercise, does not inspire any kind of confidence in Russia. It hardly can be considered as contributing to strengthening of their international security in general and the non-proliferation regime in particular. That's why we are convinced that the issue of providing non-nuclear weapon states with effective negative security guarantees is not a platitude. The global non-proliferation regime will benefit immensely from enforceable security guarantees. So let us all be absolutely frank on this. Empty proclamation don't convince anyone anymore. Mr. President, the international community has a collective responsibility to restore respect for international law and to find lasting solutions to the most urgent threats to global peace and security. It's therefore ultimate responsibility of the Security Council to spare no effort in order to achieve this overarching goal and to prove that non-proliferation system works and works effectively. Otherwise, the roadmap will be redrawn by newly emerged nuclear weapon actors. So it's this council that has to remain determined and precise in preventing such a scenario to become our tomorrow's reality. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister Kilimikin for his statement. Now I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Margot Wallström, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to you and the United States for arranging this timely and important meeting. Thank you also to USG Nakamitsu for your introduction to this subject. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is definitely a growing threat to international peace and security. I looked around this table, and before I begin my formal statement, I just want to say that I cannot help but reflect on the composition of this council, because we have Ukraine and Kazakhstan, who have scrapped nuclear weapons. We have Bolivia and Uruguay, from a continent free from such weapons. We have the 5 countries who possess such weapons, and then Japan, the only country who has experienced their destructive force and power. So it seems to me that this ought to be the perfect group of countries to move forward on this particular issue. For close to half a century, Sweden has been a champion of disarmament and the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. As so clearly articulated by the Secretary General in his opening address to the General Assembly on Tuesday, these goals are intrinsically linked, as we've already heard. We have a moral and humanitarian responsibility to make progress on both. And the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty Initiative is an expression of the widespread and well-founded frustration that exists with the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. And this will remain so until we see real progress with nuclear weapon states delivering on their commitments. Sweden is committed to the success of the current NPT review cycle, and I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate the call in successive Security Council resolutions for all states who have not yet done so to sign and ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty without delay and without conditions. In addition to providing analytical and forensic expertise, Sweden has also contributed financially in support of the IAEA verification of the GCPOA, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, and also the 1540 regime. Through the European Union, we have also contributed significantly to outreach programs designed to help countries strengthen their export control systems. Mr. President, regrettably, since we joined this Council in January, we have been called upon time and again to address the DPRK's illegal testing of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And we have condemned these provocations in the strongest terms. Likewise, we have been dealing with numerous cases where horrific chemical weapons have been used by the Syrian regime and by Daesh. This Council's efforts to stop the spread of these deadly weapons need the full support of all member states to succeed. For this reason, Sweden has called for the universal and comprehensive implementation of existing sanctions regimes. This applies not least to the non-proliferation-related sanctions on the DPRK. We must all work together to implement these sanctions fully, so as not to contribute to the DPRK's illegal nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles programs. Improved monitoring and targeted capacity building are important measures, and I join the Secretary General in his call for unity in the Council and diplomatic engagement to resolve this crisis. Atrocities such as those perpetrated in the Idlib province in April are unacceptable, and those responsible must be brought to justice. Sweden applauds the way in which the OPCW and the Joint Investigative Mechanism have fulfilled their mandate by investigating cases of alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria and identifying those responsible with a high level of expertise and professionalism. We must continue to give our full and unambiguous support to these important mechanisms. The Council must stand united to ensure the accountability of perpetrators. Mr. President, it would be remiss not to mention in this context Council Resolution 2231 and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. As stated by Federica Mogherini last April, and I quote, "The JCPOA was an historic achievement for the security of the region and of the whole world, and a success for multilateral diplomacy that has proven to work and deliver," end quote. It is absolutely vital that all parties continue to implement their JCPOA commitments meticulously and unfailingly. Strict and effective IAEA verification and the Joint Commission for addressing implementation matters are vital components of the agreement. Implementing the resolutions is just one side of the coin. We must also nurture and defend the existing multilateral instruments that we have established to curtail the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Unity is key. This applies to the Joint Investigative Mechanism, but also other important non-proliferation tools, such as the 1540 regime and the IAEA strengthened safeguard systems, to mention just two. So, Mr. President, the spread of weapons of mass destruction is one of the gravest challenges to international peace and security, and a crucial responsibility of this Council. Sweden will continue to do its part to promote disarmament and non-proliferation, respect for international law, and accountability for those who violate their international legal obligations. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Minister Wallström for her statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Taro Kono, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please allow me to begin by emphasizing how timely it is for the Security Council members to have this opportunity during the high-level week of UN General Assembly to discuss non-proliferation, an issue which the international community must tackle in unison. Japan is deeply concerned by the serious challenges facing the international non-proliferation regime. It is critical for this Council, which holds primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, to resolutely and concretely address the serious issues that are shaking the very foundation of non-proliferation regime. Given the seriousness of the situation, it is urgent that we achieve the early entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and commence negotiations of a fissile material cutoff treaty without further delay, in addition to strengthening the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons regime. Japan calls upon international community to work closely on practical and concrete measures to this end. Mr. President, North Korea has ignored the strong protest and warnings of the international community by going ahead with a ballistic missile launch that flew over Japan last week. Earlier this month, it also conducted its sixth nuclear test, which is suspected of being a hydrogen bomb test, and which was on a far greater scale than previous tests. This is an entirely unacceptable provocation. North Korea's provocative actions, including its nuclear test and the series of ballistic missile launches pose grave challenges to the international non-proliferation regime. It goes without saying that North Korea's actions clearly violate relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. They also pose an unprecedented, grave, and imminent threat to the peace and security of the region, including Japan. No bright future awaits North Korea if it continues on its present path and its isolation from the world continues. Japan strongly urged North Korea to fully implement the relevant Security Council resolutions, including the recently adopted Resolution 2375, and to immediately demonstrate seriousness and concrete actions towards a complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Japan also called for North Korea to return to compliance with NPT and IAEA Safeguards Agreement as soon as possible. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula requires international community to apply the strongest possible pressure on North Korea. Current efforts are insufficient and further pressure is needed. To this end, Japan strongly called for all UN member states to fully and promptly implement the relevant Security Council resolutions. No state should be allowed to become a loophole in the North Korea sanctions regime. Mr. President, non-proliferation of chemical weapons is another important issue that needs to be addressed by the international community. Japan, which has experienced a sarin chemical attack on its subways in the past, cannot accept the use of chemical weapons under any circumstances. In this regard, Japan condemns in the strongest terms the use of chemical weapons in the town of Han Shefun in Syria. The Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the United Nations Joint Investigative Mechanism are currently conducting their investigation to identify perpetrators of chemical attacks. Japan supports the activity of the Joint Investigative Mechanism. I would like to stress that the Security Council must be united and hold the perpetrators accountable in order to prevent recurrence of the chemical weapon use. Mr. President, finally, I would like to address the issues surrounding Iran. Japan supports the Iranian nuclear deal, which will contribute to the international non-proliferation regime and the stability of the Middle East. It is extremely important that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action be continuously and steadily implemented. In this regard, Japan supports the monitoring and verification activities of the International Atomic Energy Agency and again underlines the importance of the steady implementation of JCPOA and its spirit. The ballistic missile launches by Iran are inconsistent with the Security Council Resolution 2231. Japan strongly called for Iran to play a constructive role in the region. I would like to conclude by calling for international community to take concerted efforts against actions that threaten the international non-proliferation regime. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Minister Kono for his statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Angelino Alfano, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President, dear colleagues. I want to thank the United States for asking this meeting. Almost 50 years ago, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entered into force. Thanks to collective effort, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has become a pillar of our collective security. During all these years, Italy has been a champion of this treaty. Non-proliferation is a fundamental good that the international community and the Security Council have to preserve. Collective security cannot be guaranteed without non-proliferation. It's important to have a robust and effective implementation of the international law. There should be accountability. Nor the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has caused one of the biggest crises of our times. We have to stand firm and united to defend non-proliferation, which is a common good for all of us and a guarantee of peace, security, and stability. Italy has condemned Pyongyang's launch of a ballistic missile over Japan on the 15th of September, as well as all missile and nuclear tests. With Resolution 2375, the Council sent a clear and strong message. Further attempts of the regime to defy the United Nations will backfire. And if North Korea wants to step back from self-isolation, it must stop developing its missile and nuclear program. A different story is that of Iran, which has moved in a positive direction regarding its own nuclear program. The Iran nuclear deal has delivered gains for global security by imposing strict limits on Tehran's nuclear program. And in return, we have lifted the sanctions. It's a good example of effective diplomacy and smart sanctions. But reaching this deal was just the beginning. Now, we must continue to ensure that Iran does not sway off the path of nuclear non-proliferation. Italy, as a Security Council facilitator of Resolution 2231, will continue to foster the smooth implementation of this crucial resolution. We are concerned by Iran's missile tests, which seem inconsistent with the spirit, if not the letter, of Resolution 2231. This can worsen regional instability and can put at risk the progress made so far. Unfortunately, where we have seen no progress is in Syria. To the contrary, we have seen the repeated use of chemical weapons against innocent people. This is a horrific war crime. Those found guilty of this war crime have to be sanctioned accordingly. Therefore, we need to redouble our effort to identify anyone who has played a role in the use of chemical weapons against the defenseless civilian population. Dear colleagues, just a few more words on the use of sanctions. As chair of the 1718 Committee on North Korea, Italy has focused on the concrete effects of sanctions. It's important to monitor their implementation to get a precise picture of compliance by the membership and to address weaknesses in their enforcement. We have also placed emphasis on strengthening technical assistance and capacity building, providing member states with the necessary tools to implement the sanctions. Moreover, we have worked to increase political awareness of the sanctions framework. To this goal, the 1718 Committee has intensified its outreach activities and has facilitated regular exchange of information among member states, the committee, and the panel of experts. So far, 6 outreach meetings have taken place for each UN regional group, and we have already scheduled on the 9th of October an open briefing for all the UN membership. Thanks to this outreach, an increasing number of states are now reporting to the 1719 Committee on the implementation of the sanctions. We are seeing the results of our joint work. At the same time, Italy is engaged with our EU partners to adopt Resolution 2375 on North Korea into our legal system as soon as possible, and to identify more autonomous restrictive measures. A final remark. We want to ensure that the sanctions have an impact on the proliferation programs of the regime, but also avoid any negative effects on the humanitarian situation. Because as an international community, we care about the fate of the people of North Korea. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Minister Alfano for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wang Yi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of China.
Mr. President,
proliferation
of WMDs and their means of delivery poses a real threat to international peace and security, a common challenge to the international community. The Security Council has convened this meeting to discuss non-proliferation, build up international consensus and capacity building and deepen coordination. It is indeed a timely and important meeting. The international community has built up the non-proliferation regime. The JCPOA on the Iranian nuclear issue has set a prime example for diplomatic settlement to non-proliferation issues. With the implementation of SCR 1540, international efforts have been strengthened to deal with challenges posed by non-state actors. The international security situation is undergoing profound changes. Non-proliferation still faces challenges and risks. A few individual countries, defying consensus of the international community, have conducted several nuclear tests. Non-state actors, especially terrorists, may have bigger access to WMDs. International non-proliferation regime must increase its authority, universality, and effectiveness. Mr. President, non-proliferation is a matter of international peace and security and an important part in the building of a community of shared future for mankind. It requires international cooperation on many fronts. First, addressing both symptoms and root causes. Non-proliferation is basically a matter of security, and security concerns could be the biggest motivation of proliferation. Countries must pursue common, cooperative, comprehensive, and sustainable security and pursue a new type of international relations featuring win-win cooperation. Countries must not pursue absolute security of its own at the cost of universal security of all. Second, diplomatic settlement. It is necessary to exercise pressure as appropriate if countries blatantly violate international non-proliferation rules. But sanctions are not the panacea. Dialogue and negotiation present the fundamental way out. Confrontation and sanctions alone only lead to escalation and spillover of conflicts. And we need to discard willful use of long-arm jurisdiction because that serves no one's interests. Third, we need to uphold international non-proliferation regime. The NPT is a customary international law. The international non-proliferation regime with the NPT at its center is crucial for international security order. It has prevented more countries from obtaining WMDs and protected global strategic balance and stability. Double standards or selective approach should be discarded. Otherwise, the mention of international non-proliferation regime could be encroached. Fourthly, we need to build up non-proliferation capacity of various countries. The primary responsibility rests with governments. We need to respect and support countries in formulating their non-proliferation policies in light of national conditions and help countries build up legal systems, strengthen law enforcement, carry out mutual learning and cooperation so as to jointly enhance non-proliferation, performance and capacity. Mr. President, China firmly opposes proliferation of WMDs and their delivery and their means of delivery. We have set up a complete non-proliferation and export control system and ensured effective implementation of them. At the same time, China is also actively participating in international non-proliferation processes, fully implementing Security Council resolutions, and has been dedicated to political settlement to non-proliferation issues. China has taken an active part in negotiations on the JCPOA and made tireless efforts for negotiated settlement to the Korean nuclear issue. We have raised suspension for suspension initiative and the dual-track approach, which are feasible and practical way out for the Korean nuclear issue. China believes that Security Council resolutions on the Korean nuclear issue should be implemented in their entirety. While exercising sanctions, it's also important to promote resumption of talks and dialogue. China also supports OPCW and UN agencies in carrying out comprehensive, objective, and fair investigations into the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Mr. President, international non-proliferation efforts require participation of various countries, and vice versa is also true. China is ready to work with all parties to make greater contribution to maintaining and strengthening international non-proliferation regime, promoting cooperation on global governance, on international non-proliferation system, and building a community of shared future for mankind. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister Wang for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Secretary of State attached to the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you,
Au nom de la
President.
France, je remercie votre présidence, mais aussi les États-Unis et le secrétaire d'État Rex Tillerson pour avoir pris l'initiative de cette réunion à la fois très opportune et ô combien nécessaire. Je remercie également Madame Nakamitsu pour son intervention très éclairante. Monsieur le Président, la semaine de haut niveau de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies aura été rythmée par d'intenses discussions sur les menaces aiguës qui pèsent sur notre monde, notre environnement stratégique et à travers lui tous les fondements de la paix et de la sécurité tels que nous les connaissons est confronté à des défis majeurs et notamment dans le domaine de la non-prolifération. Le constat est amer et il est sans appel. Avec l'usage barbare d'agents toxiques en Syrie, en Irak, en Asie, nous assistons à la réapparition funeste d'armes qui sèment la peur et la mort auprès des populations et que nous pensions avoir bannies à jamais. Je pense aussi au risque croissant dans la péninsule coréenne qui aura monopolisé nombre de nos discussions cette semaine. La menace s'est désormais élevée à un niveau de plus en plus alarmant et sans précédent et elle nous concerne tous. Loin de revenir à la raison, le régime de Pyongyang poursuit l'escalade militaire et ne cesse de nous donner les preuves de son irresponsabilité par ses agissements chaque fois plus préoccupants et menaçants. Au-delà de ces cas inquiétants, nous faisons face à des flux de prolifération de plus en plus complexes et à des risques accrus de détournement des biens et technologies sensibles qui sont de plus en plus facilement accessibles. Enfin, la prolifération n'est plus le monopole d'un seul type d'acteur et le risque de voir des acteurs non étatiques mettre la main sur des matériels sensibles est désormais une dangereuse réalité. Alors, face à ces défis d'une extrême gravité, seul un multilatéralisme pragmatique et réaliste peut constituer la solution. Le cas iranien confirme que le volontarisme de la communauté internationale peut ouvrir des solutions aux crises de prolifération. L'accord de Vienne, que la France a activement contribué à construire et à améliorer, constitue un jalon historique majeur. Le président Macron l'a dit, la France y est résolument attachée. Ce serait une erreur de le dénoncer, comme il serait irresponsable de poursuivre une mise en œuvre à la carte des dispositions de la résolution qu'il a endossée. Nous devons certes répondre à l'intensification des activités balistiques de l'Iran, dont certaines sont non conformes à la résolution 2231. Un tel comportement est déstabilisant pour la sécurité régionale et nuit, bien sûr, à la confiance mutuelle. Monsieur le Président, pour le dire autrement, il ne peut y avoir d'alternative au régime de non-prolifération. C'est une ligne constante dont la France n'a jamais dévié. C'est particulièrement vrai sur le volet chimique syrien où les responsables de la tragédie du 4 avril, qui a été rappelé par de précédents orateurs, et de tant d'autres attaques devront rendre des comptes. Cela vaut aussi pour la crise en cours dans la péninsule coréenne, à laquelle nous devons répondre avec fermeté et unité. La seule issue à la crise est de tracer la voie d'une solution négociée. Alors que la Corée du Nord refuse cette perspective et fait le choix d'un dangereux isolement, seule la fermeté peut nous doter du levier recherché pour amener le régime à la table des négociations. Monsieur le Président, l'action collective pour contenir la prolifération passe par le dialogue et la discussion directe sur les crises. Mais elle passe aussi par l'action, une action concrète et opérationnelle. Pour contenir et endiguer la prolifération, nous devons, plus que jamais, accroître notre mobilisation. Mais ne négligeons pas la vertu de l'existant. Si le régime actuel de non-prolifération est gravement mis à l'épreuve, il a aussi fait ses preuves. Le Conseil de sécurité est engagé de longue date dans son renforcement. Il peut compter sur l'appui des organisations internationales capables de vérifier le respect par les États de leurs engagements et d'établir la réalité des faits et des responsabilités. Je veux à cette occasion saluer l'action de l'Organisation pour l'interdiction des armes chimiques et de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie atomique. En outre, le multilatéralisme dans la non-prolifération, c'est aussi, comme ailleurs, le renforcement de la coopération et de l'échange d'informations. Des mécanismes comme les régimes de contrôle des exportations et l'initiative de sécurité contre la prolifération participent d'un mouvement vertueux rehaussant notre niveau de vigilance. Nous devons œuvrer à leur renforcement. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, je souhaiterais rappeler une vérité simple. Ce qui est en jeu dans le risque d'affaiblissement du régime de non-prolifération, c'est l'existence même de la norme du droit, au-delà de son autorité et de la nécessité de sanctionner ces violations. Nous devons réaffirmer qu'au-delà des différences politiques contingentes, aussi profondes semble-t-elle, il y a des règles fondamentales qui ne peuvent être transgressées. La non-prolifération y figure au premier rang, car c'est un intérêt commun supérieur pour toutes nos nations. Le message de la France est simple. La lutte contre la prolifération est une responsabilité collective. Chacun doit y prendre sa part, toute sa part. Il n'y a de place ni pour le constat d'impuissance, ni pour le fatalisme, ni pour l'instrumentalisation politique. Nous pouvons et nous devons faire davantage. Il en va de notre responsabilité actuelle, de notre crédibilité future et de notre capacité à préserver les futures générations des risques d'érosion, voire d'effondrement de l'architecture de non-prolifération. Soyez assurés, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs, du plein engagement de la France dans cet effort. Je vous remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lemeon for his statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mark Field, Minister of State for Asia and the Pacific of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary Tillerson, for calling this important meeting of the Security Council. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is the gravest of regional and international security concerns. This threat does not respect national borders. The proliferation of these weapons must end. We all play our part in this. Our shared rules and norms are designed to keep the world safe. This Council has a responsibility to prevent proliferation, to tackle threats, and to respond when these weapons are used. Individual nations also have a responsibility to implement the measures imposed by the Council, and indeed to be ready to go further when the situation requires. Individually and collectively, we must enforce these rules, working through organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or as groups of concerned states. If we are to succeed, this Council and strong multilateral institutions must be at the heart of that approach, and we must persist when countries continue to defy the international rules-based system. That is why it is right that we have collectively developed a framework of sanctions against North Korea, and that we have continued to strengthen these sanctions in the face of the DPRK's dangerous provocations. In Seoul only last month, I was struck by the focus of President Moon's government in trying to resolve the situation, recognizing that what has long been a regionalized dispute now has truly global ramifications. Let us be clear. Secretary Tillerson has made it clear that the US does not regard regime change as desirable, nor accelerated reunification of the peninsula, nor to garrison its forces north of the 38th parallel, nor indeed to harm the North Korean people. Yet, the DPRK has responded with yet more missile tests and another nuclear test. Whilst the regime prioritizes its military programs, North Korean people suffer deprivation and hardship. That is why we must all continue to press North Korea to respect the Council's resolutions, and even at this late stage, to change its reckless course. We must enforce the measures that we have adopted and be prepared to expand them if North Korea continues on this reckless path. Turning to the very different case of Iran, we now know that the multilateral system can and will continue to deliver results. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has succeeded in limiting Iran's nuclear capability. Iran has rolled back its nuclear program. The International Atomic Energy Agency has had unprecedented access. So the British government will continue to abide by our commitments under that deal, and we urge other parties to do the same. Iran must continue to do so if we are all to have confidence in the peaceful nature of its nuclear program. However, whilst the JCPOA has dealt with one risk, others, as we all know, remain. Iran continues, of course, to play a destabilizing role within its region, and its ballistic missile testing remains inconsistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Iran must respect the call of this Council and cease these activities. As other members have said, the situation in Syria also poses the most serious proliferation challenges. This year, sarin gas has again been used as a weapon, a clear violation of the international prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. There must be no impunity for the perpetrators of these terrible crimes against humanity. The UK government calls upon members of the Council to support the vital work of the Council-mandated Joint Investigative Mechanism and to renew its mandate. And we must keep driving forward our efforts based upon UNSCR 1540 to prevent non-state actors from acquiring and using weapons of mass destruction. We all recognize that these proliferation challenges are very complex. They require a persistent and united approach in line with existing treaties and norms. That is why the UK government, for one, does not believe that the treaty banning nuclear weapons, which opened for signatures yesterday, is helpful. It will only, I believe, create unnecessary divisions and undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which rightly sits at the heart of all of our non-proliferation efforts. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, this Security Council has a heavy responsibility to protect international peace and security. Member states share that responsibility and must play their part in implementing the Council's resolutions. We now need to work tirelessly together to stop proliferation, to save lives, and to make the world a safer place. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Field for his statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Enrique Leodel, Vice Minister for Political Affairs of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Uruguay.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the delegation of the United States for convening this meeting. I also thank them for the concept note disseminated to us. At the same time, I thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Madame Izumi Nakamitsu, for her statement. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is a grave and real threat for international peace and security. Speaking in this Security Council about the proliferation of such weapons compels us to recall that all states have a duty to respect their obligations pursuant to international law. They are also obliged to respect the provisions of the United Nations Charter. In 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, was hailed as the most important international agreement in the field of disarmament. On the one hand, non-nuclear weapon states committed to not acquiring or developing or producing such arms. We also committed to having this verified by the international community, and we also committed to using nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Nuclear weapon states, on the other hand, committed to getting rid of such weapons. The NPT became the cornerstone of the disarmament and non-proliferation regime. It requires its three pillars to be enforced in a balanced fashion, that is, disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. The NPT is the only treaty which is currently enforced regarding this type of weapons. 30 years later, two of the three countries that are not signatories to the NPT detonated nuclear bombs and joined the category of nuclear weapon states. Recently, a third state that withdrew from the treaty has now joined this category of states. We cannot turn a blind eye to this fact. President, as we stand 1 year from marking the 50th anniversary of the NPT, we can say that unfortunately the goal of achieving general and complete disarmament is far from being achieved. Today, disarmament is in a state of gridlock, or worse still, we are taking steps backwards. Allow me to cite Article 6 of the NPT. I quote, all parties to the treaty commit to pursuing negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. The commitment undertaken by nuclear weapon states is far from having been fully upheld. A clear example of this is the absence of nuclear weapon states from the negotiating process which led to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Yesterday this opened for signature, and our country is proud to be a signatory to this treaty. The use and threat of use of nuclear weapons are a crime against humanity and a grave violation of international law, including international humanitarian law, just as they are a violation of the United Nations Charter. The only guarantee against the use and threat of use
use of these weapons is their expressed prohibition and their total elimination. At a time when tension in the Korean Peninsula continues to escalate, and at a time when the threat of the use of nuclear weapons and the threat of a military conflict is keeping everyone on high alert, it is necessary to remain calm and ensure that we protect peace and global security. Nuclear weapons must never again be used by any actor or under any circumstances. There is no military solution to the North Korean problem. The solution must be a political one. The Security Council must remain united on this issue and must continue to uphold its commitment to a peaceful and diplomatic solution to the situation in the Korean Peninsula. Any other option would be an immense failure for this Council and this organization. Uruguay can only contemplate a solution to the North Korean issue which is found through dialogue, negotiation and political commitment between parties. That is the only solution we can uphold. President, regarding chemical weapons, Uruguay condemns the use of toxic chemicals as weapons against civilians in any armed conflict. Such actions constitute war crimes, and those responsible for such crimes committed must be held accountable and brought to justice. In this connection, Uruguay supports the work undertaken by the fact-finding mission of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and we commend the work of the joint investigation mechanism between the UN and the Organization for the Prohibition of the Chemical Weapons that has been instituted to clarify who is responsible for the incidents in Syria. The JIM has identified the terrorist group ISIS, Daesh, and the government of Syria as responsible for some of the chemical attacks in Syria. Uruguay also wishes to underscore the importance of halting the proliferation of conventional weapons and their spread towards areas of conflict. The trafficking and trading of arms with and among warring parties in armed conflicts directly contributes to the suffering and death of civilians, as was previously stated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay in May in this very council, quoting the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The minister stated that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council supplied 75% of the total export volume of arms in the period 2011-2015. As a country resolutely committed to bolstering the disarmament and non-proliferation regime, Uruguay issues from this rostrum a dynamic appeal to all states to urgently comply with all obligations on disarmament and non-proliferation in line with the international legal framework in force. In particular, President, we issue this appeal to those states that produce, possess and sell arms. Disarmament and non-proliferation must be a priority for all, with no exceptions being made. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Leodel for his statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of Senegal.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Mr. President, allow me to start by conveying to you the apologies of His Excellency, Mr. Sidiki Touré, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Senegal, who, as a result of clashes in his schedule, was not able to take part as he had planned to do. Having said this, our delegation would like to thank the United States of America for having requested this meeting, and of course we'd like to thank the Ethiopian presidency for having facilitated the convening of this meeting. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, whose very important statement has shed light on our work. Mr. President, our debate today is a topical one given recent events. Recent events who constantly remind us of the pressing nature of the terrorist threat and the growing risk of seeing non-state actors acquiring nuclear, chemical and biological weapons. Indeed, the rapid progress of science and technology, globalization, constant changes in international affairs, are all new factors which non-state actors could use to help them to acquire weapons of mass destruction. This is demonstrated, on the one hand, by the use of chemical weapons in the Middle East and in Asia, and on the other, questions related to cyber security, whose consequences could be even more serious if there were to be attacks aimed at critical infrastructure, such as, for example, nuclear power plants. Now, in the Korean Peninsula, the DPRK methodically pursues its military nuclear program. This in brazen violation of relevant Security Council resolutions, thus, or rather, with as their objective acquiring nuclear weapons and their means of delivery, which of course seriously undermines the non-proliferation regime and exacerbates tension in the region and beyond. Our topic clearly shows us the need to rigorously implement the commitments contained in the various relevant resolutions. Indeed, without real political will to put an end to it, the risk of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction will continue to grow. President, in light of all these factors, my country condemned as firmly as is possible the launch for the second time in less than a month of a North Korean ballistic missile, which flew over the Japanese island of Hokkaido before it crashed into the Pacific. Launch which took place less than a week after the adoption by this very Council of Resolution 2375, which condemned North Korea's sixth nuclear test dated September 3rd. Targeted measures rightly adopted by the last resolution of this Council against North Korea must, to meet the challenge posed by the North Korean ballistic and nuclear program, be slotted into a comprehensive political strategy prompting the parties to engage, with the assistance of the international community, in frank dialogue whose ultimate objective would be the respect by the DPRK of its international obligations and, of course, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This is why my country, in reiterating our commitment to a peaceful diplomatic settlement of the Korean crisis, would like to again call for a resumption of direct dialogue between the various parties to thus create conditions conducive to peaceful coexistence between the peoples and countries of the region. For now, however, the challenge to be met by all of us, international organizations, states, the world of business, remains that of the implementation of the current sanctions measures, because the lack of effectiveness of the implementation affords the North Korean authorities with gaps which they use to mobilize the necessary resources to pursue their illegal and dangerous program. President, we must work to strengthen the NPT by making it universal and by promoting respect of previously reached agreements and commitments. Indeed, Senegal remains convinced that to work for the universalization of the NPT and the implementation of its relevant provisions, just like acting in a resolute way to see the entry into force on the CTBT, constitute decisive steps on the path towards general and complete disarmament. Furthermore, it is more necessary than it has ever been in the past to draw up an inventory of all sources of weapons of mass destruction throughout the world to ensure that they are carefully controlled, placed under guard, or destroyed. Significant measures have already been taken to this end, but a great deal remains to be done. President, in an independent world, where all of our interests are interrelated, strengthening of cooperation in the field of border monitoring and controls, monitoring financial flows, and the Internet, of mutual legal assistance, all of these things are more necessary than ever so in the past to elaborate a strategy to prevent and combat weapons of mass destruction falling into the wrong hands. This requires, of course, sharing of experience, but also synergy of efforts of all relevant players. President, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation are two interdependent objectives. This is why, to speak of general disarmament, is nothing more than hypothetic words when other states, in fact, violate the NPT, attempting to acquire nuclear weapons. In the field of non-proliferation, our efforts must work towards nuclear disarmament, and our initiatives should give pride of place to the multilateral framework afforded us by the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Senegal for his statement. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you.
Господин председатель.
Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Сразу хотим сказать откровенно.
We want to start by stating candidly, we are surprised by the inclusion of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction amongst country topics. There are other, more inclusive formats for this. Now, we view the right format for Security Council meetings on non-proliferation as, first and foremost, one of a discussion of general principles for resolving this problem, rather than in fighting states which were unfortunate enough to have been qualified by individual members of the Council as so-called pariah states. This is just the approach that we see in the US's concept note, which artificially links three country situations which have absolutely nothing in common with one another. To understand the thrust of what is occurring, a quick journey back in time is needed. Russia and the United States stood at the origin of the development of a concept of international cooperation for countering weapons of mass destruction from falling into the hands of non-state actors, which in 2004 took form as Security Council Resolution 1540. Our countries reaffirm the importance of erecting a legal and enforcement bulwark on the path of such atrocities through intergovernmental cooperation. After this, however, the landscape started to change palpably, and this concept was sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical maneuvering by some of our partners, which led to a serious destabilization of the situation in a number of regions throughout the world. Now, what the use of non-proliferation mechanisms to exert pressure on unpopular regimes has led to is well known. The fate of Saddam Hussein, who, as is well known, had no weapons of mass destruction, although he was accused of possessing them. Muammar Gaddafi, who voluntarily renounced the development of his own, all served as a trigger for accelerated development by some states of the weapons of mass destruction programs. This doesn't in any way, of course, justify the DPRK's missile and nuclear programs, but to ignore the reasons for them is to be very short-sighted. Having used the chaos provoked from abroad in Syria and Iraq and the Libyan military intervention in Libya, extremists of all stripes gained broad leeway to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction. What is all this if not a most brazen violation of 1540? New and unprecedented challenges have emerged. Attempts to get the Security Council, if not to react, then at least to notice these obvious facts, continue to be consciously blocked without any serious justification. Let us recall, for example, that in Resolution 2118, there is the fact that it contains the obligation for Syrian neighboring states to immediately inform the Security Council of any attempts by non-state actors to acquire weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. Judging by the absence of any reports to the Council, one could conclude that there simply is no problem here. In fact, however, our attempts to raise this issue in the 1540 Committee were resolutely suppressed by our Western partners. We repeatedly heard of the use by ISIL fighters and other groups of toxic substances. There are reports of their access to both the technology and the infrastructure for the manufacture of chemical weapons. These problems require careful investigation by the Security Council. However, thanks to the efforts of some of our partners, they continue to be passed over in silence. Mr. President, let us speak frankly. Syria no longer has any state chemical weapons program. And the non-proliferation of weapons in the Syrian context is only about preventing it from falling into the hands of non-state actors. As far as we know, no one has submitted any evidence to the contrary to the OPCW. Furthermore, the Russian-Syrian proposal of a comprehensive investigation of the US's version of the terrible events in April in Han Shayhun were met with firm opposition. The result was that so-called verified information of the alleged presence at the Syrian airbase in Shararat of chemical weapons used as grounds for acts of aggression by a UN member state has still not been cross-checked either by OPCW experts or by experts of the joint OPCW UN investigative mechanism, the JIM. And all of this, despite the fact that the facility has been open to them since April. We are convinced that it is just in the attempts by our partners to force existing facts into the classic Procrustean bed or straitjacket of their political setups that the root cause for the emergence in the Middle East and Northern Africa of the chimera of chemical terrorism lies, which only started to abate after the Syrian people achieved a turning point in their fight against terrorism. Mr. President, we are convinced that the key to an effective non-proliferation regime lies in a rejection in the interference in the affairs, in the domestic affairs of states, a rejection of policies of changing regimes in unpopular regimes, and the creation of a single indivisible system of security for all states without exceptions. Without resolving the aforementioned issues, the Security Council sanctions measures in the field of non-proliferation will merely freeze current problems, but not actually resolve them, especially so when the central role of the Security Council in maintaining international peace and security is undermined by the introduction of illegitimate unilateral measures. Abiding by these principles has demonstrated its effectiveness in the elaboration of the JCPOA, which serves as a symbol of the triumph of multilateral diplomacy, which has reaffirmed the potential for settling the most complex of problems through negotiations as long as the requisite political will exists. Now, the information exchange verification monitoring mechanism allows us to move forward on the path towards a broader IAEA conclusion regarding the peaceful nature of the Iranian nuclear program. According to the results of its regular investigations, the agency confirms that Iran fully complies with its obligations. It was a surprise that we learned today from the mouth of the Secretary of State that Russia is undermining the IAEA. This is something new, of course, to us. Unfortunately, we have of late noted the irresponsible unilateral attempts to torpedo this breakthrough collective agreement. We hope that common sense will prevail in the end, and the plan will be allowed to become fully operational, allowing for the use of its unique potential. The key here is implementation in good faith by all member states of the JCPOA of their voluntary commitments. At the beginning of our statement, we said that these country situations are not linked to one another. But I would like to correct myself. Iran and the DPRK today did find themselves linked, because if the United States leave the JCPOA, this will be the worst signal we can send to North Korea. Similar, and in fact even more intensive diplomatic efforts are now needed in the Korean Peninsula. And one needs to start now without wasting any time, without waiting for the logic of confrontation to definitively prevail. We are convinced that the reasons for tension in the peninsula are not only Pyongyang's nuclear missile program and the military hyperactivity carried out in the region under their pretext but also the absence of any mechanism to provide a single individual system of security for all Northeast Asian states. It is clear that without such political diplomatic mechanisms to resolve the problems in the Korean Peninsula will simply be impossible. We see a solution in the implementation of the Russian-Chinese initiative, which currently is the only plan of action on the table. A step in the right direction would be for the Security Council to endorse the well-known Four No's concept, which was spelled out by the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who is present here. By way of conclusion, I will again stress that further prospects in the field of non-proliferation cannot be considered in isolation from the overall strategic concept. Realpolitik presupposes a comprehensive taking account of all factors which have a bearing on strategic stability and international security. And these include, first and foremost, the ongoing creation by the United States of a missile defenses and NATO's joint nuclear mission carried out in violation of Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT. Russia is interested in strengthening the weapons of mass destruction and proliferation regime and will do all in its power, focusing on active cooperation with regional and international partners. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Bolivia desea agradecer el informe brindado por la subsecretaria general adjunta y alta representante para asuntos de desarme, señora Izumi Nakamitsu. Al mismo tiempo, saludar la presencia entre nosotros de su excelencia, la señora Kang Kyung-hwa, ministra de Relaciones Exteriores de la República de Corea. Señor presidente, el incalculable poder destructor de las armas nucleares ha hecho imperativo que la proscripción jurídica de la guerra sea estrictamente observada en la práctica. Si ha de asegurarse la supervivencia de la civilización y de la propia humanidad. Las armas nucleares, cuyos terribles efectos alcanzan indistinta e ineludiblemente tanto a las fuerzas militares como a la población civil, constituyen, por la persistencia de la radioactividad que generan, un atentado a la integridad de la especie humana y aún pueden tornar finalmente toda la Tierra inhabitable. Así reza parte del preámbulo del Tratado para la proscripción de las armas nucleares en América Latina y el Caribe, más conocido como el Tratado de Tlatelolco. Vengo de una región, la primera región en declararse como zona de paz. Bolivia, un Estado constitucionalmente pacifista, promueve la cultura del diálogo y del derecho a la paz, así como la cooperación entre los pueblos del mundo, con pleno respeto de la soberanía a través de la diplomacia de los pueblos. Nuestra Constitución prohíbe la fabricación y uso de armas químicas, biológicas y nucleares en el territorio boliviano. Reiteramos nuestro llamado a todos los estados, particularmente a los estados poseedores de armas nucleares, a eliminar la función de las armas nucleares de sus doctrinas, de sus políticas de seguridad, de sus estrategias militares, de sus discursos políticos y de sus arsenales. Señor presidente, Bolivia durante su presidencia del Consejo de Seguridad en el mes de junio llevó a cabo un debate abierto titulado Acción Mundial para prevenir la proliferación de armas de destrucción masiva por agentes no estatales, con el propósito de reforzar el sistema preventivo para evitar la catástrofe humanitaria, política, económica y ambiental que podría resultar del uso de armas nucleares, químicas o biológicas por un actor no estatal, en particular por grupos terroristas. Creemos firmemente que la resolución 1540 es una plataforma de asistencia y cooperación entre los estados para impedir que los agentes no estatales tengan acceso a las armas de destrucción masiva, ya sean químicas, biológicas o nucleares. No estamos en total desacuerdo que se pretenda muchas veces utilizar esta plataforma como un mecanismo para ejercer coerción o como canal de sanciones en contra de estados. Señor presidente, Bolivia expresa una vez más su más firme y enérgica condena a los lanzamientos de misiles balísticos, así como los ensayos nucleares realizados por la República Popular Democrática de Corea. Y hacemos un llamado a este país para que abandone su programa nuclear y de misiles balísticos de manera completa
verificable
We call
e
upon the
irreversible
DPRK to
y
completely
que
abandon
cumpla lo
its nuclear
dispuesto
and
por las
ballistic missile program
resoluciones
in a
del Consejo
complete,
de
verifiable, and
Seguridad.
irreversible fashion, and we call upon them
Rechazamos
to comply
cualquier
with the
acto de
provisions of
provocación,
Security Council
cualquier acción
resolutions. We
unilateral y
reject
cualquier
any
acción
act
tomada
of
al margen del
provocation,
derecho
any
internacional y los
unilateral
principios de
action,
la
or
Carta
any
de las
action
Naciones
undertaken
Unidas
outside
que
the
pongan
framework
en
of
riesgo la
international
paz
law
y la
and
seguridad
outside the principles of the
internacionales,
Charter of the United
especialmente en la
Nations, and
península
any
coreana.
action which jeopardizes
Por
peace
tal
and
motivo,
international security,
instamos a todas
particularly
las
on the Korean
partes
Peninsula. For
involucradas
this reason, we
a evitar
urge
el
all parties
incremento de las
involved to
tensiones y la escalada de
avoid fanning the
retórica
flames of
y
tension
llamamos a
and
detener
escalating
esta
rhetoric,
espiral de
and we
confrontación
call
y
upon
amenazas
all
del uso de la
parties to
fuerza
curb
bélica,
this spiral of
de
confrontation
respuestas
and
nucleares
threats
o
of the use
amenazas
of
de
military
destrucción
force.
completa de una de las partes. Debe entenderse que no existe una salida militar a la situación de la península coreana.
To completely destroy one
Hacemos
of the
eco de
parties.
las
It must
palabras
be
del
understood that there
secretario
can be
general
no military
Antonio
solution to the
Guterres
crisis on
cuando
the
declara, y
Korean
cito,
Peninsula. We echo the words of Secretary General
como la
Antonio
resolución
Guterres when he
2375 lo
said that
dispone,
Resolution
se debe crear
23
una oportunidad para el
that
compromiso
as the Resolution
diplomático
2275
a fin de
states, we must
resolver la
create a
crisis
diplomatic
en la península
commitment and
coreana. La
opportunity to
solución debe ser
resolve the
política. No
crisis
debemos
on the
caminar
Korean
hacia la
Peninsula.
guerra.
The solution
Debemos
must be a
mostrar
political
un
one. We
mayor
cannot march
compromiso
towards
con el
war. We
objetivo
must
universal
demonstrate more
de un
resolute
mundo sin
commitment
armas
to the
nucleares.
global goal
Cierro
of a
comillas.
world without
En lo que va del
nuclear
año,
weapons.
el Consejo de Seguridad
This year so
aprobó
far,
3
the Security
resoluciones con
Council has
sanciones cada
adopted
vez más duras,
3
las cuales es muy posible
resolutions with increasingly
que tengan
harsh sanctions.
distintos
It
tipos
is
de
very
consecuencias.
possible that
Consideramos
these
que, como
resolutions
bien lo
will have
disponen las propias
various
resoluciones,
consequences.
no
We
solamente es
believe that as the
necesario trabajar en la
resolutions
implementación de las
themselves state, we should
sanciones,
not only
debemos también
work
trabajar
on
en acercar a las
implementing the
partes a la
sanctions, we
mesa
should
del
also
diálogo
work on
y
bringing parties
retomar
back to the
las
table of
reuniones
dialogue and
sextipartitas.
negotiations and resume
En tal
six-party
sentido,
talks.
Bolivia
In this
reitera
connection,
su apoyo a la
Bolivia
iniciativa
reiterates its
china de la
support
doble
for the
contención que
Chinese
permita
suspension
llevar a
for
cabo
suspension
un cese
initiative. This will
simultáneo
make it
en la
possible
península
to
coreana,
undertake
así como la
simultaneous
propuesta
cessation of
ruso-china y su
hostilities
hoja de
on the
ruta,
Korean
que a este
Peninsula. We
momento
also
es la única
support the
propuesta concreta
Russian-Chinese
presentada
proposal
para
and
resolver
roadmap,
esta
which at the
situación.
moment is the only
Señor
tangible
presidente, es
proposal on the
importante
table to
resaltar los
resolve
grandes logros
the
alcanzados
situation.
en el
Mr.
tema de la
President,
no
it's important to
proliferación a
underscore
través
the
del
major
diálogo
achievements
y los
seen on the
medios
issue of
pacíficos.
non-proliferation.
El ejemplo más
Through dialogue
destacable es
and
el Plan
with
Integral de
peaceful
Acción
means. The most
Conjunta
noteworthy
sobre el
example is
programa
the Joint
nuclear iraní,
Comprehensive Plan of Action
el cual
on
fue
the Iranian
negociado con los
nuclear
5
program.
miembros
This was
permanentes del
negotiated
Consejo de
with the
Seguridad,
5 permanent
la
members
Unión
of the
Europea
Security
y
Council,
el
the
Organismo
European
Internacional de
Union, the
Energía Atómica.
IAEA.
Ello puso de relieve la voluntad de las partes para alcanzar como resultado la no proliferación de armas nucleares. Todos los informes y las organizaciones internacionales señalan que Irán sí está cumpliendo con ese compromiso. Por eso nos llama profundamente la atención que una de las partes pretenda acabar con ese compromiso y generar mayor inestabilidad en la región. Es imprescindible que aprendamos de las lecciones del pasado y que la presencia o no de armas de destrucción masiva deje de convertirse en un caballo de Troya para aplicar políticas de cambio de régimen y de destrucción de estados. Señor presidente, me permito concluir esta intervención señalando o repitiendo algunos de los parágrafos preambulares del Tratado sobre la prohibición de las armas nucleares que fue abierto para la firma ayer. Conscientes de los sufrimientos y daños inaceptables causados a las víctimas del uso de armas nucleares, Hibakusha, así como a las personas afectadas por los ensayos de armas nucleares, recordando que de conformidad con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, los Estados deben abstenerse en sus relaciones internacionales de recurrir a la amenaza o al uso de la fuerza contra la integridad territorial o la independencia política de cualquier Estado, o en cualquier otra forma incompatible con los propósitos de las Naciones Unidas, y que ha de promoverse el establecimiento y mantenimiento de la paz y la seguridad internacionales con la menor desviación posible de los recursos humanos y económicos del mundo hacia los armamentos. Este tratado señala en su primer artículo que cada Estado parte se compromete a nunca y bajo ninguna circunstancia desarrollar, ensayar, producir, fabricar, adquirir de cualquier otro modo, poseer.
All right, everyone, we are going to cut out of our UN feed to switch it up and bring you some local news. We have a water main break out of North Phoenix. This is 7th Street and Bell. 7th Street and Bell. These are live aerials, courtesy of Skyfox. But it looks like Skyfox has now left the scene, so it was fun while it lasted, guys. Let's leave it at that. I guess it's time to go back to the United Nations.
In his remarks at the opening of the General Assembly, told us that global anxieties about nuclear weapons are at the highest level since the end of the Cold War. It is impossible to disagree with that assessment. Indeed, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is posing serious threat to global peace and security. Nowhere has this danger become more pressing currently than in the situation surrounding the DPRK. In this context, I would like to underline the following 3 points. First, it is important to comprehensively address the risk of proliferation through political and diplomatic means aimed at finding a negotiated solution. The modality through which the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action, JCPOA, participating states managed to address the Iranian nuclear issue is indeed a significant achievement for multilateralism. The JCPOA and the follow-up mechanism of the Security Council on the implementation of the Resolution 2231, as well as the progress registered so far in the implementation of the JCPOA, have taught us a very important lesson. By that, I mean what was achieved amounted to being an example for how pressing issues of peace and security could be addressed through diplomatic means. Of course, we recognize that much more needs to be done by the participating states in clearing misunderstanding and avoiding any possible obstacle to the full implementation of the JCPOA. Second, based on the lessons learned from the JCPOA and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2231, the Security Council and the international community might have to explore mechanisms to address the serious and imminent threat posed by the nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction programs of the DPRK. The continued provocation activities of the DPRK should not be a cause for weakening the unity within the Council, which is so critical for the effectively pursuing our broader objective of addressing the risk of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. This brings me to my third point on the broader threat posed by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. This has to do with the now very possible scenario of weapons of mass destruction failing in the hands of non-state actors and the real and present danger this poses to international peace and security and to humanity. Multilateral agreements such as the Biological Weapon Convention, the Chemical Weapon Convention, and the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons continue to eminently contribute to the prevention and elimination of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. They need to be adhered to in a scrupulous manner. But still, much more needs to be done to ensure the universal accession and full implementation of such agreements. Regional nuclear-free zones, such as the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, also remain central to the global and regional non-proliferation regime and the creation of the world free of nuclear weapons. The Security Council plays a critical role in addressing the serious threat posed by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by using all the available tools at its disposal, including through sanctions. However, all of us should be able to fully implement Council measures for them to meet their intended objectives. I would therefore like to conclude my remark by affirming Ethiopia's commitment to work toward this objective. Now I resume my function as a president. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Kang Kwang-Wa, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to the Council. Thank you, Secretary Tillerson, for calling for the meeting. Thank you, USG Nakamitsu, for the briefing. It is indeed a great honor to come back to the Council, although under very different circumstances and under very different responsibilities. Let me be brief. It's late in the day, but let me start by reaffirming my government's strong commitment to strengthening the global non-proliferation regime. As outgoing chair of both the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the Missile Technology Control Regime, we have led the strengthening of the multilateral export control regime.
All right, everyone, it looks like Chopper is now back at the scene of that water main break, so we're going to take you back to these Skyfox aerials. Again, this is a situation in Phoenix at 7th Street in Bell. These are live Skyfox aerials. You can see this water main break, lots of water flowing as a result. Okay, for those of you just joining us, you can see the amount of flooding that has resulted because of this water main break in Phoenix. This is North Phoenix, 7th Street and Bell. You can see this vehicle driving through the flooded waters there in that parking lot. The water continues to gush in that parking lot of this business plaza. This strip mall, you can see this is adjacent to an Elements massage. Some of you may be interested in seeing a map of this region relative to the rest of Phoenix. I'm going to go ahead and pull up this map for you. All right, everyone, as promised, I want to go ahead and show you guys this map so you have an idea of where this water main break is relative to downtown Phoenix. There is Phoenix right here, downtown, Fox 10 right here. This water main break is right here at 7th Street and Bell. There is a large shopping center here. We do know that this water main break is adjacent to the Elements massage, so let's go ahead and try to find that. So there is the Elements massage in Moon Valley, and we know that this water main break is adjacent to this. Let's go ahead and look at a satellite view. This water main break is right here, and water gushing throughout this parking lot. This parking lot also has a Safeway as well as a Planet Fitness and the Avalon School of Cosmetology in El Pollo Loco. We can see that this parking lot is the area that's flooded. I'm going to go ahead and go back to those live aerials now so you guys can see the flooding there. This is the northwest corner of 7th Street and Bell, where this water main break is taking place. We'll continue to watch these live aerials for as long as Skyfox provides them. All right, everyone, so it appears that Skyfox is now leaving the scene of this water main break. Skyfox leaving the scene of this water main break. All right, everyone, you're now looking at aerials of the scene of a fire at a mobile home. This fire took place in the last hour. Upon arrival, Phoenix fire officials found this mobile unit engulfed in flames. Upon fire attack by the first-in crew, the roof collapsed on the motorhome, which hindered their extinguishment. Unfortunately, authorities found a body in this debris. A man in his 50s, according to neighbors, lived there in this mobile home. He had health issues. He lived by himself in this unit. And this individual, again, passing away in this fire. Investigators are on scene, and the fire is now under investigation. This mobile home fire, not too far from that water main break, 14th Street and Bell. Quite a sad story here. Again, these are Skyfox aerials coming in from North Phoenix, 14th Street and Bell. A man in his 50s found dead inside a mobile home that was on fire in the last hour. As you can see, firefighters have now extinguished the blaze. Unfortunately, they found a body, a man in his 50s. According to neighbors, this man lived by himself, and he did have some health issues. We are now going to switch stories here on News Now. I know many viewers were interested in hearing from the Russian foreign minister at the UN. I want to play this for you guys now before we wrap things up.
Excellency Sergey Lavrov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in December last year, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution on promoting the democratic and equitable world order. And it clearly states that it's unacceptable to interfere in the internal affairs of states. It does not accept coups d'etats as a way of transfer of power. It underscores the need to exclude from international relations the attempts to exert illegal pressure of one state on others, and this includes the extraterritorial use of national laws. The absolute majority of member states of the UN voted in favor of the resolution. In the minority were found exactly those countries which, against the goals and principles of the Charter, are trying to dominate in global affairs, are trying to impose models of development, impose their own values on states and peoples. They are guided by the logic of unipolarity, which undermines international law. But the world does not stand still. We're pleased to see that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, the day before yesterday, from this rostrum, unilaterally stated that it's important to abide by the principle of sovereignty in international affairs, that it is important to lead by example rather than dictate one's will to other peoples, that countries with different values, culture, and aspirations can not just coexist, but they can work side by side on the basis of mutual respect. And I think that this is something that we all can subscribe to, especially so if the foreign policy of the United States will be carried out on this basis exactly. Sovereignty, rejecting interference in the affairs of other states, the equality of peoples, mutual respect. Russia has always abided by these principles in its international dealings and will continue defending it. In the past 25 years, our country, despite difficulties, has honestly gone through its share of the road down toward the elimination of the heritage of the Cold War and did a lot in order to strengthen trust and understanding in Europe and the Atlantic and in the world. This was not with reciprocity on the part of our Western partners because they're made heady by the illusion of the world of history, and they're trying to adjust to today's realities, the rudimentary rules that come from the era of opposing alliances. NATO is trying to restore the climate of the Cold War and is refusing to implement the principle they solemnly declared in the 90s, the principle of equal and indivisible security in the OSCE area. The West constructed its policy on the basis of the principle of you are not with us, you against us, and they proceeded with a heedless expansion of NATO to the east, provoked instability in the post-Soviet area and fostered anti-Russian sentiments. And this policy is where we can find the roots of the lengthy conflict in Ukraine. Despite the attempts through a Normandy format and the contact group, the authorities in Kiev are coming up with new ploys so as not to implement their commitments under the Minsk complex of measures of 12 February 2015, which was approved by the Security Council of the UN. But even under these conditions, we're aiming at working constructively, finding mutually acceptable ways of implementing the Minsk agreements. Reacting to the concerns expressed as regards the state of play in the area of security, President Putin launched the initiative to have a UN mission to help protect OSCE observers in the Donbass, and a draft resolution on this topic is with the Security Council. We expect that the Russian proposal will help settle the crisis within Ukraine, which erupted as a result of an anti-constitutional coup d'etat carried out by ultra-radicals. We do hope that there will be constructive, without zero-sum game interaction on this with our partners in Europe and in the United States. Here, on the premises of the United Nations, we should not forget about the origins of the United Nations. The verdicts of the Nuremberg Tribunal became a warning for us against forgetting the lessons of World War II and the catastrophic consequences of trying to decide the fate of the world by trampling underfoot the legitimate interests of other states and peoples. It's a sacrilege to use the guise of freedom of expression in order to condone the radical movements which have neo-Nazi ideology, trying to glorify fascists and their acolytes. What is needed is consistent efforts aimed at creating a barrier against neo-Nazism and revanchism, against extremism and xenophobia, towards strengthening international and cultural harmony, while fomenting hatred and intolerance. Terrorists, extremists, nationalists destroy and desecrate objects which are of historic, religious, and cultural value. Civilized Europe is allowing the removal of monuments to the liberators of the continent, heroes of the war, which laid the foundation for the UN. We think it's necessary to immediately pay priority attention to this issue and the General Assembly and in UNESCO to make sure that we have the necessary legal frameworks in order to stop these kinds of acts. And Russia is planning to come up with a proposal on this. It is unacceptable to remain indifferent also when we're witnessing in Europe the shameful event of statelessness, as well as the suppression of the languages of minorities, which is a violation of Council of Europe conventions. Centuries of history have shown that lasting settlement of differences can only be through dialogue and finding a balance of core interests of conflicting parties. Unfortunately, the arsenal of many Western states have not diplomacy but rough pressure. Using unilateral sanctions above the sanctions which are being imposed by the Security Council is illegitimate and undermines the collective nature of international efforts. Everyone is witnessing with alarm today the newer and newer restrictions by the U.S. against Iran, and they happen to be also extraterritorial in nature, and they threaten the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which became one of the more important factors of regional and international stability. How wrong unilateral sanctions are has been shown a long time ago. And the good example here is a more than 50 years long American embargo of Cuba. This is something that basically all member states of the UN have been for decades asking for, and we need to start listening to them. We're witnessing also a very dangerous confrontation spiral around DPRK. We resolutely condemn the nuclear missiles adventures of Pyongyang in violation of Security Council resolutions. But military hysteria is not just an impasse, it's a disaster. All of the Security Council resolutions have to be implemented. No one's arguing with that. But all of them and all of the sanctions have provisions on the need to go back to negotiations. We call upon the end to blocking these provisions. There is no alternative to the political and diplomatic ways of settling the nuclear situation on the Korean Peninsula. We call upon members of the world community to support Russia-China roadmap, which is contained in the joint statement by the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of Russia and China on the 4th of July. It is unacceptable to incite to riots and threaten to use force in order to democratize Venezuela or undermine the legitimate authorities in any country. In any domestic conflict, the international community has to encourage parties to reach a national reconciliation and compromise. The attempts to ignore the opinions of others, use ultimatums outside of the UN Charter, never led to anything good. The upsurge in international terrorism, millions of refugees, waves of illegal migration results to a great part from the reckless attempts to remove the undesirable regimes, including military intervention, which wrought chaos and destruction in Middle East and North Africa and opened up the path for terrorism in the part of the world where they never used to exist. Despite the fact that ISIL is in retreat in Syria and Iraq, we need to make quite a few additional efforts in order to stabilize the region. Let me recall the need to combat not just ISIL, but also Nusra, which for some reason is being spared by members of the American coalition. The development of the situation in Syria is such that it gives rise to guarded optimism on our part. On the 14th and the 15th of September, there was a 6th international meeting on Syria in Astana, and there we formalized the 4 de-escalation areas. And the agreements on that was reached with the participation of Russia, Iran, Turkey, US, Jordan, and the UN with the support of many other countries. And these agreements create the conditions for further moving forward towards the implementation of Resolution 2254 on the basis of direct dialogue between the government and opposition, pooling their efforts in the interest of the quickest elimination of the terrorist hotbed and making sure that there is peace throughout the country, that its unity is restored and the acute humanitarian issues tackled. The most urgent ones are increasing the level of humanitarian assistance and demining the liberated territories. We're convinced that these processes, with the leading role played by the UN and without any preconditions, also need to involve all of those who sincerely wish peace for Syria and its people. Another topic here is the instances of the use of chemical weapons in the region. All of them need to be investigated honestly and professionally without attempts to manipulate OPCW and the joint investigative mechanism of OPCW. Resolving humanitarian issues, bringing opposite sides to agree, all of this is also relevant for other crises in the region, including Libya, Yemen, and Iraq. In all of these situations, and many other conflicts as well, Russia has had a balanced approach and worked with all parties. Now, when we're talking about the Middle East and North Africa, here we should not relegate to the background and even less so forget the UN solution to the Palestinian issue and the Arab Peace Initiative. We attach great importance to restoring Palestinian unity and welcome efforts made by Egypt in this regard. Russia stands ready to assist in any way in the resumption of direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine and Palestine to cooperate for this with the League of Arab States and the Quartet. The fact that the Palestinian issue is not settled is being used by the extremists. They use this in order to recruit new new people to their ranks. A string of bloody terrorist acts in the world shows that it's an illusion to try and create separate islands of security. Extremism and terrorism is something that we need to combat only together without using double standards or hidden agendas. where the main responsibility need to be borne by states, and this is exactly what is provided for in the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. We welcome the initiative of the Secretary General to reform the anti-terrorism activity of the United Nations system, which was approved by the General Assembly. And the fact that a Russian representative was appointed to head the new UN Office of Counterterrorism, we view as acknowledging the role Russia plays in fighting the scourge, and we thank everyone for their support. Russia is committed to the goals of having a world which is free of nuclear weapons. Under the existing treaty regimes in the area of control and NPT, its elimination should be the end result of a process of comprehensive and full disarmament while providing equal and indivisible security. Attempts to outlaw nuclear weapons without taking into account the realities of the world today and closing our eyes to all of the factors which influence strategic stability only push this goal further away and undermine the consensus regimes of NPT and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty regime. We should reject the idea of militarization of cyberspace. We have to make sure that we do not allow that this becomes an area for military and political confrontation, that the ICT be used as an instrument of exerting pressure or inflicting economic damage of spreading terrorism and extremism ideology. We need to aim the UN at working out rules which are in the interest of all states, rules of behaving responsibly in the digital sphere. We prepared a draft of the Universal Convention on Counteracting Cybercrime, including hacking, and we propose that we start discussing this already in the course of this very session. It is obvious that in the future, the world will continue encountering a whole range of new issues which will be long-term and which will be truly civilizational in nature. We have no right to dissipate our efforts and strength on geopolitical games. What's needed here is not unilateral but collective approach. The process of creating a polycentric world order is an objective trend. It reflects the redistribution of the global balance of power, the greater role played by the cultural and civilizational identity of people. This is something that everyone will need to adapt to, including those who is used to lording it over others. It is in everyone's interest to not try and constrain this natural process. We have to make sure that the world order is just and democratic, as it was seen by the founding fathers of the UN. Globalization should not antagonize us, but bring us together, take into account the interests of all states without exception, help bring stable and safe future for humankind as a whole. Without mutual trust, it is impossible to think that we will be able to implement the far-reaching SDGs and the Paris Agreement on climate change, or resolve such issues as food security, demographics, and healthcare, which are so important for the developing countries. Among the foundational principles of international relations, we should include the principle of political pluralism, the freedom of choice, and the rule of law. We need to reject military alliances, but rather assist and extend security guarantees to those states which chose neutrality. In the economic area, this means lowering the barriers to trade and investment. It means we have to stop politicizing our economic ties. We should also not politicize the international Olympic and athletics movement overall. Our young people should be nurtured on respect to the cultural and civilizational diversion of the world today. We invite everyone to attend the 19th World Youth and Students Festival, which our country is going to host in less than a month from now in Sochi. At the same time, we in Russia will also be hosting another important meeting, the 137th Assembly of the Interparliamentary Union in St. Petersburg. The main topic there will be strengthening peace and security through intercultural, interreligious dialogue. Let's foster this dialogue between various cultures and religions. Let's stop using historic events in order to stoke hatred and phobias. The philosophy of coexistence, of harmonizing the interests of various countries, is at the basis of the concept put forward by the President Putin, the concept of greater European partnership, open to all states of Asia and Europe and aimed at creating a joint economic and humanitarian space based on the principle of indivisible security. I don't need to say here that ensuring equal rights for everyone, for states and citizens, is something that is needed on the universal scale, is also required by the Charter. This just principle is the foundation for the activity of many entities that we are part in. CIS, the CSTO, Eurasian Economic Community, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. This is also how we build our relationship with ASEAN, the African Union, CELAC, and other associations bringing together countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Together, we are going for more balanced approaches in such entities as a G20, APAC, International Monetary Fund, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We believe in the future of the UN, and we want to see an active role to be played by the Secretary General in helping it realize its full potential on the basis of the goals and principles of the Charter, whilst respecting the prerogatives of international bodies of the UN. We need to be especially careful when we're talking about peacekeeping reform. We shouldn't be proceeding harshly here and forget the priceless experience garnered over decades. More 2,000 years ago, the Roman philosopher Seneca said, "We are born to coexist together." And the founding fathers of the UN understood this better than anyone. They were convinced of this and put it in the Charter. They saw that the coexistence given to us by God on this planet should compel us to come together to save us from the scourge of war. For this, we need to restore today the culture of dialogue. Look for the balance of interest instead of rash decisions and desire to punish the disobedient. We're talking about here about preserving humankind in all of its diversity and multiplicity. Russia has always been and will remain open to joint work with everyone who shows a reciprocal readiness for an equal and mutually respectful cooperation. We will continue defending this approach to the UN in the interest of improved global governance and real democratization of international relations. I thank you for your attention.
All right, everyone, so that wraps up this edition of News Now. That was Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, speaking before the United Nations General Assembly. Again, this is the end of our stream today. We're on a shortened schedule because we are short-staffed. We'll see you back tomorrow morning. Thanks for watching.